Oh, it's win or go home time in the fantasy football playoffs, week 16. All the marbles are on the line so you can fight to get to your fantasy championship in week 17. There are tough calls to be made, and Heath Cummings and I'm Dave Richard, we're going to help you make those tough calls, at least some of them, with some players that we're getting word about from fantasy managers like you. You guys want to know who should we start and sit? We're going to tell you some tough calls. And let's start with maybe the toughest of them all, Heath. Austin Ekeler of the LA Chargers. 2 games ago against Denver, he was amazing. Last week, not so good in a blowout loss against the Raiders of all teams. Where do you come out on Austin Ekeler?
I think he's a low-end RB2 in full PPR leagues, more of a flex in non-PPR where you can't have much help. He's going to be splitting things 3 ways, but it's not a great matchup based on the way the Bills have played lately. But certainly I wouldn't call him a must-sit because he still has that 5-catch upside.
There's too much uncertainty to call him like a top 12 type of fantasy running back, but there's too much upside to get him out of your top 24. So I'm with you. I think he's in that middle to low end RB2 range, a running back that you can start and feel decent about. I thought he looked terrible last week, but I think the matchup is not so bad for him against Buffalo. I know Buffalo made the Cowboys look silly a week ago. Now they're on the road on a short week. And I think the workload could bounce back. You saw it in the first half of the game against the Raiders. He still played over 60% of the snaps, still worked in a lot of passing downs. You can see Heath and I have him ranked the same way. Jamie Eisenberg a little bit lower on Austin Ekeler, but none of us have him as a top 15, much less top 20 fantasy running back. Let's talk real quickly on another running back we're getting questions about, Derrick Henry. 1 sentence, Heath. What do you look at with him?
It's the same thing as Ekeler, really. Immense upside, very, very low floor as we saw last week. I would slightly prefer Ekeler in full PPR, but I'll take Henry in non.
I'm with you on that for now. There's some things about the matchup that I think I might actually like with Derrick Henry. The fact that in the past 5 games, Seattle's allowed 5 rushing touchdowns to running backs, 4.8 yards per carry, almost 2 yards before contact in those 5 games. That's the thing that really hurt Derrick Henry. All right, that's 2 running backs. Now 1 quarterback. Tua Tagovailoa has been a roller coaster this year. And really over the second half of this year, it hasn't been a very fun roller coaster at all. Not a lot of upside. 1 game in his last 4 where he's been over 16 fantasy points. Where do you have Tua Tagovailoa ranked this week, Heath?
He's a borderline top 12 quarterback. We've been talking about this since October. We knew the schedule would be awful in the fantasy playoffs, and actually the production went downhill before we even got to the fantasy playoffs. I think you view him right now as someone that you start only if you don't have someone else you like. And he's not the must-start quarterback that he was earlier this season.
So let me give you a couple of names. You tell me if you have them ranked ahead or behind Tua Tagovailoa. Do you have Baker Mayfield ahead of him?
I will take Baker.
What about Jared Goff?
Definitely Jared Goff.
Matthew Stafford and Joe Flacco. Line those 2 up against Tua Tagovailoa.
It's Tua by a pretty fair margin over those 2 for me.
So I'm debating between Tua and Stafford. I don't like that Stafford's playing on a short week, but I do like the way that Stafford has been playing lately. And I can't get it out of my mind what the Buffalo Bills did to the Dallas Cowboys last Sunday. They ran the ball like crazy. Josh Allen didn't have to throw that much. There is a very real possibility that the Miami Dolphins do the exact same thing against the Cowboys. I think he truly is a tough call. I think he truly is a low-end QB1 this week. Let's move it to the wide receivers. The first one we're going to talk about is T. Higgins, 22 fantasy points in PPR last week, 2 touchdowns, really helped that along. We know there's no Jamar Chase. We know they're playing the Steelers. This looks like a good situation. What do you think about T. Higgins?
I am a little bit worried. I think he's really just a low-end number 2 or a high-end number 3. A 3-wide receiver league is the only league where I would call him a must-start option. He's already had 2 games this season where he had 8 targets and fewer than 5 fantasy points. Higgins has had really high highs like we saw last week and extremely low lows. And I think with Jake Browning, we know that at any point he could turn back into a pumpkin. So not a must-start wide receiver, but certainly some upside there.
I'm actually encouraged by Jake Browning's ADOT last week. It was 9.0 yards. That's almost double what he had been giving us in his prior starts. That tells me that the Bengals are willing to let him throw it a little bit more, and he did it against Minnesota. I think that's a pretty good defense. This Steelers defense, Heath, pass rush, usually good, but they won't have Cam Hayward. He's in the concussion protocol. They're making changes at inside linebacker. They're making changes at safety because they have to, and I wonder if the Bengals try and take advantage of that, and I wonder if there's some downfield opportunities again for T. Higgins. I like him as a low-end number 2 wide receiver, but I think I like Drake London more. And Drake London was a total dud last week. A lot of us on Fantasy Football Today talked about him not having a good week. That certainly came to pass, but the week before, he was amazing. So which Drake London are we going to get? The stud or the dud?
It's been pretty easy. This is one of the easier ones to diagnose. When Drake London's playing at home, he's a high-end number 2 wide receiver. When Drake London's on the road, you should not even consider him as a top 40 wide receiver. At least that's what we've seen so far. I wouldn't be surprised if we see the same thing here. This Colts pass defense does not scare me. I am starting Drake London as number 2 wide receiver.
And we really haven't seen much of Drake London with Taylor Heineke. The one game that Heineke started and finished, Drake London didn't play in. The other 2 games that Heineke did play in, London was on and off the field. They've only been together for 23 routes so far this year. 3 targets, 2 catches for Drake London in those games. You can see the difference in our rankings for Drake London this week. Jamie Eisenberg has him as a top 12 wide receiver in PPR. Heath has him just outside the top 24. There could be a move up there. I've got him as a top 20 wide receiver. I think that there is a big opportunity for Drake London to get a lot of targets, catches, and yards and find the end zone against the Indianapolis Colts. I like that upside. I want to trust Drake London, particularly in a game that I think the Atlanta Falcons are going to have to throw in. I think they're going to play from behind. That's usually been the recipe for Drake London to go and put up big numbers. Last but not least, a tight end who came back into the fantasy orbit last week. It was Darren Waller. You look at our rankings, there's a pretty good consensus there, anywhere between 11th and 14th. That means he's a low-end tight end 1. Heath, why do you have Darren Waller at 14?
Well, he is playing with Tommy DeVito. He did just only play 42% of the snaps in his first game back, and he's an older tight end who's had hamstring issues all season long. So there's certainly a risk that he goes out there and runs one route, a bigger risk than most, and just doesn't do anything for you the rest of the day. But I did like the fact that he had a 26% target per route run last week. I like the fact that he averaged 1.8 yards per route run. That's why I'm considering him as a potential starter. I might move him up into that 12 to 13 range, but it's not like there's a high floor here with Tommy DeVito and Waller's injury history.
I do feel like he can be better than he was last week, but not necessarily be a top 5 type of fantasy tight end. I think it's safe to call him a low-end tight end 1. And it is the holiday season, and there is some last-minute shopping going on, but there's always time to do shopping in Dynasty leagues. Heath Cummings, you are the deacon of Dynasty for our Fantasy Football Today shows. Do you have a buy list for Dynasty Fantasy League managers?
Here are 4 players that I am looking to buy before the 2024 season. I think that what we've seen from Kyler Murray is not what we should expect to see from him moving forward. He had been a guy that had never been worse than 20 fantasy points per game, had regularly been around 25. To expect him to hit those marks coming right off of the long-term absence was not fair, but I will buy him as a QB1 moving forward. I think Tyjae Spears, some people might already know this, but there's a chance for him to be a top 20 running back next season if Derrick Henry goes away. I'd like to buy him. JSN, I've heard people talking about not being a top 3 rookie wide receiver anymore. He hasn't produced like one this year, but he still has all the same talent and tools. He just played alongside DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. Buy JSN as a top 12 dynasty wide receiver. And then listen, Kyle Pitts was the consensus easy number 1 pick from his rookie class. He was the number 1 tight end for 2 seasons. Now he's fallen out of some people's top 5s. I still have hope that with a new head coach, with a new quarterback, Kyle Pitts can be the elite fantasy tight end that we once projected him to be.
I love that list. Here's a question for you. Would you accept the 6th overall pick in a rookie draft, so 1.06, in exchange for Jackson Smith and Jigba?
No chance. I would give it up for Jackson Smith and Jigba, yes.
Would you give up the 101 for Jackson Smith and Jigba?
Probably not the 101, but anything after 4 for sure.
The 101 is probably going to be a very good wide receiver for dynasty managers. If you toiled this year in your leagues, you should be amazing. And by the way, Fantasy Football Today is on top of the dynasty scene every single week, not just now, but during the offseason. Heath Cummings hosts the show. He does a fantastic job. It is can't miss listening if you've got 1, 2, 5 Dynasty leagues. And speaking of can't miss listening for fantasy football, we are going to continue to do daily shows all the way through the end of the regular season in the NFL. And then in the offseason, 3 times weekly, it's Fantasy Football Today. Download it wherever you get your podcasts and look for it on YouTube. Like and subscribe there.